the autumn of 1857, something happened in Jackson, Mississippi that the local authorities buried so deep it took over a century for whispers to surface. On Thanksgiving night, in what was once the grandest plantation house in Monroe County, a slave named Elias supposedly killed his master with his bare hands, snapping Colonel Nathaniel Broderick's neck like a dry twig. But here's what makes this story different from other tales of slave rebellion. Witnesses claimed Elias's strength that night was inhuman, strong enough to crush a man's skull with one hand, bend iron tools into pretzel shapes, and leave handprints pressed so deep into oak beams they're still visible today. The official records were sealed, the witnesses silenced, and the entire incident scrubbed from local newspapers. What really happened on Broderick Plantation that Thanksgiving? And why did 3 separate county officials spend the rest of their lives claiming that what they saw that night defied all natural explanation? The story begins in the heart of Mississippi Territory, 15 miles south of Jackson, where the Pearl River carved its slow path through some of the richest bottomland cotton country in the South. By 1857, Broderick Plantation had grown to encompass over 3,000 acres, worked by nearly 200 enslaved souls, who lived in the shadow of Colonel Nathaniel Broderick's imposing Greek Revival mansion. Broderick himself was a man of contradictions, a Boston-born lawyer who'd moved south in his 20s, drawn by the promise of easy wealth and cotton speculation. Unlike many plantation owners who were born into the system, Broderick had chosen it, and perhaps because of that choice, he ruled his property with a methodical cruelty that shocked even his neighbors. He kept meticulous records of punishments, maintained detailed breeding charts for his human property, and was known throughout Monroe County for his cold, scientific approach to slave management. The enslaved community at Broderick Plantation lived in 2 distinct quarters, the field hands in rough-hewn cabins near the river, and the house servants in slightly better accommodations closer to the main house. It was a world of whispered conversations, hidden knowledge, and survival strategies passed down through generations. The older slaves spoke of better times under Broderick's predecessor, a gentler man who'd sold out when the colonel arrived with northern capital and southern ambitions. Among this community, Elias stood apart. Not because of his size, though at 6'4" he towered over most men of his era, but because of his strange history. Broderick had purchased him 3 years earlier from a bankrupt plantation in Louisiana, and the bill of sale listed unusual details: strong constitution, unusual physical capabilities, possible medical anomaly, buyer assumes all risks. The seller, a Frenchman named Boudreau, had been eager to part with Elias despite his obvious value as a field hand. Elias never spoke of his previous life, but the other slaves noticed things. He could work 16-hour days in the cotton fields without showing fatigue. He could lift cotton bales that normally required 2 men. His hands, when examined closely, showed calluses so thick and developed they looked almost like horn. The plantation blacksmith, an enslaved man named Isaiah, swore that Elias could bend horseshoes with his bare hands, though he was careful never to display such abilities where the overseer might see. But it wasn't just physical strength that set Elias apart. There was an intelligence in his eyes, a literacy carefully hidden that suggested education far beyond what any slave was permitted to possess. Late at night, some claimed to see him scratching symbols in the dirt outside his cabin. Not English letters, but something else entirely. Something that looked almost like formulas. Colonel Broderick took a particular interest in Elias, though not out of kindness. The colonel had heard rumors about the slave's unusual capabilities, and saw an opportunity for both profit and scientific inquiry. Broderick fancied himself a man of learning, a subscriber to phrenology journals and agricultural periodicals that discussed the natural variations in human specimens. He began conducting what he called strength assessments on Elias, timing his work, measuring his output, and documenting his capabilities in leather-bound journals kept locked in his study. These sessions took place in the plantation's old carriage house away from prying eyes. Broderick would have Elias lift increasingly heavy objects, anvils, tree trunks, even sections of iron machinery, while he took notes and made calculations. The colonel was particularly fascinated by what appeared to be Elias's ability to work without fatigue, often pushing him for hours beyond the point where normal men would collapse. By autumn of 1857, these assessments had taken on a darker tone. Broderick had begun inviting guests to witness what he called his demonstrations. Wealthy planters from neighboring counties came to see the slave who could allegedly perform feats of impossible strength. Some of these demonstrations involved lifting contests. Others required Elias to bend iron bars or break thick wooden planks with his bare hands. But as Thanksgiving approached, something began to change in Elias's demeanor. The other slaves noticed it first, and a tension in his movements, a distant look in his eyes, as if he were calculating something. Isaiah, the blacksmith, later told investigators that Elias had begun asking strange questions about the plantation's layout, about Colonel Broderick's habits, about which of the house servants had access to which parts of the mansion. The Broderick household was preparing for what the colonel planned to be his grandest Thanksgiving celebration yet. He'd invited over 40 guests from as far away as Memphis and New Orleans, including several who'd specifically requested to see his remarkable specimen. The menu had been planned for weeks, with special delicacies ordered from as far away as Baltimore. Most importantly, Colonel Broderick had planned a special after-dinner demonstration featuring Elias, one that he promised would astound his guests and cement his reputation as Mississippi's most forward-thinking plantation owner. What Broderick didn't know was that Elias had been listening. The house servants, moving invisibly through the mansion as they prepared for the celebration, had overheard conversations about the planned demonstration. More disturbing still, they'd glimpsed some of Colonel Broderick's private journals, left carelessly open in his study. The entries they saw spoke of terminal experiments, ultimate strength limitations, and acceptable losses in the name of scientific advancement. As Thanksgiving Day 1857 dawned crisp and clear over the Mississippi bottomlands, both Colonel Broderick and Elias were making their final preparations. Neither man knew that before the night was over, one of them would be dead and the other would vanish into the wilderness, leaving behind only questions that would haunt Monroe County for generations to come. Thanksgiving, November 26, 1857, began like any other holiday at Broderick Plantation. But for those who knew where to look, the undercurrents of tension were impossible to ignore. By dawn, the mansion's kitchen was alive with frantic preparation as house slaves worked under the sharp eye of Martha Kinsey, the head cook, preparing a feast that would seat nearly 50 guests in the plantation's grand dining room. Elias had been assigned to help prepare the grounds, setting up additional seating on the mansion's wraparound veranda, and ensuring the oil lamps were properly filled and positioned for the evening's entertainment. But those who worked alongside him noticed something different. His usual eagerness to shoulder the heaviest burdens had been replaced by a careful calculation of effort. It was as if he were conserving strength for something important, a strategy instead of his usual show of sheer force. Colonel Broderick spent the morning in his study, reviewing his notes and preparing for what he privately dubbed the grand demonstration. His journals from that day, discovered decades later during the mansion's demolition, revealed his excitement about showing his guests what he believed would be the ultimate proof of his theories about human limitations. The final entry, written in his careful script that morning, read, "Tonight I shall push the specimen beyond all previous thresholds. Science demands nothing less than complete understanding." The guests began arriving around noon, their carriages creating a steady stream along the plantation's oak-lined drive. Among them were some of the most prominent names in Mississippi society. Judge Silas Drummond from Jackson, plantation owner Samuel Harlan from Natchez, and Dr. Nathaniel Grayson, a physician from Memphis, notorious for his writings on racial physiology. But the guest who drew the most attention was Professor Emanuel Weiss, a German immigrant who claimed expertise in what he called physical anthropology, and had traveled from as far as St. Louis to witness Broderick's famous slave. As the afternoon stretched on, the guests enjoyed their pre-dinner drinks on the veranda, while Elias continued his preparations with the precision of a man following a carefully rehearsed plan. Isaiah, the blacksmith, later told investigators that when he tried to engage Elias in conversation around 3 o'clock, the larger man had looked at him with eyes that seemed to see right through him, as though his mind were elsewhere entirely. The dinner itself proceeded without incident. The guests feasted on roasted turkey, sugar-cured ham, cornbread stuffing, and seasonal vegetables, all prepared by skilled hands who moved invisibly between kitchen and dining room. The conversation flowed as freely as the Madeira wine, with discussions of cotton prices, Mississippi River trade, and the growing tensions between North and South that would erupt into war just 4 years later. But as the evening approached its climax, Colonel Broderick stood to address his guests, his face flushed with wine and anticipation. "Gentlemen," he announced, his voice carrying over the murmur of conversation, "tonight you will witness something that challenges everything we thought we knew about the limits of human capability. My specimen, Elias, will demonstrate feats that would have been considered impossible just a generation ago." The guests followed Broderick out to the old carriage house, their voices buzzing with excitement and skepticism. Torches had been arranged around the building's perimeter, casting dancing shadows against the weathered wooden walls. Inside, the space had been cleared except for an array of testing apparatus. Iron bars of various thicknesses, wooden beams, and even sections of railroad iron arranged on heavy wooden blocks. Elias was already waiting inside, his massive frame silhouetted against the torchlight. But something about his posture, the way he held his shoulders, the angle of his head, suggested a readiness that went beyond mere physical preparation. Dr. Grayson later wrote in his private diary that looking at Elias that night was like looking at a spring wound to its breaking point. All controlled energy waiting for release, Colonel Broderick began with his usual demonstrations. Elias lifted weights that should have been impossible for any man, bent iron bars that should have required machinery, and split thick oak beams with his bare hands while the guests watched in astonishment. Professor Weiss took copious notes, muttering in German and occasionally asking Broderick to repeat certain tests. But as the evening wore on, Broderick's demands grew more extreme. He ordered Elias to lift heavier weights, bend thicker iron, break harder wood. The guests, initially impressed, began shifting uncomfortably as they realized they were witnessing not just a display of strength, but systematic torment disguised as scientific inquiry. It was Judge Drummond who first noticed the change in Elias's expression. Around 10:30, as Broderick ordered him to attempt lifting what appeared to be a section of railroad track, something in Elias's demeanor shifted. The careful compliance, the measured responses, all of it vanished, replaced by something that made the judge involuntarily step back. "Colonel," Drummond said quietly, "perhaps we've seen enough for one evening." But Broderick, caught up in the thrill of his own spectacle, waved off the suggestion. "Nonsense. We're just reaching the truly interesting thresholds. Elias, I want you to attempt something we've never tried before." He gestured toward a massive piece of machinery moved into the carriage house earlier that day, the iron flywheel from a cotton gin, weighing easily 400 pounds. For a long moment, Elias stared at the flywheel, then at Colonel Broderick, then at the circle of expectant faces surrounding them. When he finally spoke, his voice was so quiet several guests had to lean forward to hear. "No, sir." The simple refusal hit the gathering like a physical blow. In the antebellum South, a slave's direct refusal of a master's command was unthinkable. An act of defiance so complete it demanded immediate and violent retribution. But something in Elias's tone, in the way he held himself, gave everyone pause. Broderick's face cycled through surprise, anger, and finally a cold fury his guests had never seen before. "What did you say?" "I said no, sir." Elias's voice was still quiet, but there was something beneath it now, something that made Professor Weiss stop writing in his notebook and Judge Drummond retreat another step. "You will do as I command," Broderick said, his voice tight with rage, "or you'll face consequences that will make our previous sessions seem like gentle encouragement." For a moment that stretched into eternity, the two men faced each other across the torchlit space. Then Elias smiled, and several of the witnesses later swore they'd never seen an expression more terrifying. "No, sir," he said one final time. "I don't believe I will." What happened next unfolded so quickly most witnesses struggled to process what they'd seen. Elias moved toward Colonel Broderick with the fluid grace of a man half his size, covering the distance between them in 3 impossibly quick strides. Broderick had time to raise his hands, perhaps to shout or plead, but no time to escape what was coming. The sound that followed, described by multiple witnesses as resembling a thick branch snapping in a storm, would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Colonel Nathaniel Broderick, master of 3,000 acres and nearly 200 human souls, died instantly as his neck was snapped with an audible crack. But it wasn't just the killing that horrified the witnesses. It was the ease of it. Elias had ended his master's life with no more effort than breaking a twig. For a moment frozen in time, he stood over Broderick's body, his massive hands still positioned as if holding something delicate that had simply broken. Then he looked up at the circle of horrified faces, and when he spoke, his voice carried an intelligence and education no slave was supposed to possess. "Gentlemen," he said with perfect diction and a faint, unplaceable accent, "I suggest you leave now." The stampede that followed was anything but dignified. Prominent citizens of Mississippi society trampled each other in their desperation to escape the carriage house, abandoning all pretense of status in their panic. Within minutes, Broderick Plantation was empty, except for the slaves in their quarters, the body of their former master and Elias, who stood alone among the scattered apparatus and flickering torches. What happened in the hours that followed remains one of the great mysteries of that terrible night. The house slaves, terrified, stayed in their quarters until dawn. When they finally emerged, they found the carriage house empty, the torches burned out, and Colonel Broderick's body gone. Elias had vanished as completely as if he'd never existed, leaving behind only the deep handprints pressed into the oak beams where he'd once demonstrated his strength, and a plantation full of people who suddenly had no master, no direction, and no idea what came next. But the disappearance of Elias and the colonel's body was only the beginning. Within hours, riders were dispatched to Jackson, telegrams were sent, and officials began arriving at the plantation. What they found launched an investigation that consumed the authorities for months and left questions that remain unanswered to this day. The immediate aftermath of that, Thanksgiving night, created chaos throughout Monroe County. By dawn of November 27th, word had spread through the network of plantation owners, overseers, and county officials who formed the backbone of Mississippi society. The implications were staggering, not just because a slave had killed his master, but because of how completely Elias had vanished, and how traumatized the witnesses had become. Judge Drummond, one of the most respected legal minds in the state, returned to Jackson in a state his clerk described as complete nervous prostration. Dr. Grayson, the Memphis physician, checked himself into a private sanitarium and refused to speak of the events for over a year. Professor Weiss simply disappeared, abandoning his hotel room and leaving behind only a trunk of notes, written in a mixture of German and mathematical symbols that no one could decipher. Sheriff Thomas Breckinridge arrived at Broderick Plantation at first light with armed deputies and volunteers from Jackson. What they expected was a crime scene, evidence of violence, maybe even an ongoing revolt. Instead, they discovered something far more unsettling. The house slaves, when questioned, gave accounts that were consistent yet maddeningly unhelpful. Yes, they had heard raised voices from the carriage house around 10:30. No, they had not investigated. Slaves learned early not to interfere in a master's business. Yes, they had seen lights moving around the plantation late into the night, but they couldn't say who carried them or where they went. Most frustrating of all, when pressed about Elias, the slaves seemed almost unable to provide useful descriptions. He was tall, they agreed. He was strong, but when asked about his habits, his personality, his relationships, they grew vague, evasive, as though they were either concealing something or genuinely uncertain who Elias really was. Isaiah, the blacksmith, proved to be the most forthcoming. Under pressure from Sheriff Breckinridge, he admitted Elias had possessed strength far beyond any man. But when pressed for detail, his story grew stranger. He could work all day without getting tired, Isaiah said, twisting his hands nervously. But it wasn't natural tired, you understand. It was like he was powered by something else. And sometimes at night I'd see him writing in the dirt, but not English. Some other numbers, some other language. And sometimes he'd talk to himself, not just talk, but command, like he was used to giving orders. The physical evidence was equally baffling. The carriage house showed clear signs of the demonstration: bent iron bars, broken beams, scattered weights. But there was no blood. There were no tracks leading away despite the soft earth that should have preserved them. Most disturbingly, there was no body. Sheriff Breckinridge organized search parties that combed the bottomlands for miles. They dragged ponds, searched abandoned cabins, followed creeks and rivers in every direction. But Elias had vanished as completely as morning mist. As days turned into weeks, the investigation took on a desperate quality. Governor William McWillie, under pressure from plantation owners, authorized a $500 reward for Elias's capture, an enormous sum that drew bounty hunters from as far away as Memphis and New Orleans. Wanted posters went up describing a large Negro male, 6'4", unusually strong, extremely dangerous. But the description was so generic it could have applied to dozens of men. Stranger still were the reports that began filtering in. Hunters claimed glimpses of a giant figure moving through the forests at night. Settlers found campsites that seemed to have been occupied by someone of enormous size and strength. Trees were discovered uprooted or bent in ways that suggested superhuman force. More unsettling were rumors spreading through the enslaved population, whispers of a man called the Strong One who was coming to set things right. By Christmas of 1857, Elias was less a fugitive and more a legend. Northern newspapers soon got hold of the story, running sensational accounts of the Mississippi Superman who killed his master and disappeared. Concerned about the state's reputation and about inflaming sectional tensions, the governor quietly ordered all records sealed, the reward withdrawn, and newspapers discouraged from further coverage. But the secrets couldn't be contained. When Broderick's estate was settled in early 1858, his executors found hidden papers in a false drawer of his desk, correspondence with Northern universities discussing physiological enhancement, receipts for chemical compounds, ordered from Boston laboratories, even a contract with a Boston company called Meridian Research Associates for something described as ongoing enhancement protocols. Disturbingly, one document bore not just Broderick's signature, but also handwriting that slaves identified as Elias's own. These documents were seized, sealed by court order, and transferred to federal custody. The house slaves who recognized Elias's writing were quietly sold to distant plantations. Officially, the discoveries never existed, but rumors spread of experiments that had gone beyond simple cruelty, experiments meant to alter men into something else entirely. By spring, the famed Pinkerton Detective Agency had been drawn into the case, hired quietly by unknown parties. Their investigation uncovered an even darker picture. Medical experiments stretching back years in Louisiana and beyond, funded by Northern investors and conducted under the guise of studying disease among slaves. Subjects like Elias had been dosed with chemical compounds, put through brutal regimens and tested for endurance and strength. Most died. Some improved slightly, but a few, like Elias, became something more. The most troubling part of the Pinkertons' report wasn't what Elias had been made into. It was what he had become. He hadn't simply escaped. He'd planned it. And he wasn't alone. There were others, scattered across plantations and hidden facilities. Men and women altered like him, capable of feats that defied belief. And Elias, it seemed, was finding them. By the fall of 1858, coordinated escapes were being reported across Mississippi, Louisiana, and Arkansas. Entire groups of anomalous slaves vanished, leaving behind broken chains twisted apart by bare hands, records destroyed, evidence erased. In Tennessee, a military research site was raided by what survivors described as an organized strike force led by a towering figure they swore was Elias. Not a chaotic revolt, but a precise operation. They freed subjects, destroyed files, and left behind a chilling message carved into the walls. The chains are broken. The strong shall no longer serve the weak. By 1859, the federal government itself was forced to confront what they now called the Elias crisis. Rumors of a network, the Freedom Chain, helping these enhanced individuals escape. Whispers of foreign spies seeking the secrets of the experiments. Even sightings of Elias himself in Washington, D.C., walking openly through the streets as if daring authorities to stop him. Congressional hearings began, exposing some of the truth, the experiments, the Northern funding, the military's interest. Testimony revealed that Elias's strength exceeded 4 times that of normal men, that his intellect had grown beyond prediction, and that he possessed leadership qualities no master could contain. A statement smuggled into the hearings, signed by Elias and dozens of others, demanded recognition of their humanity and an end to the experiments, or else. Panic spread. Military units were deployed. Rewards soared. Yet Elias and his followers remained always one step ahead. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the crisis ended. Not with war, but with secret negotiations. what later came to be known in whispers as the Washington Compact. The terms were never revealed to the public, but the essence leaked through rumors. The experiments were ended, the records destroyed, and the enhanced subjects given choices, new identities to blend into society, or exile to remote lands where they could live free. Elias himself, they said, chose separation. He disappeared into the wilderness, his fate unknown, though whispers claimed he helped found hidden communities far away, places where the strong ones lived on. The Civil War soon overshadowed everything. Casualties, politics, emancipation. History forgot Elias, but some say traces remained. Strange marks in abandoned plantations, unnatural handprints pressed deep into oak beams, legends among native tribes and freedmen of a giant man who appeared in times of danger, only to vanish again into the shadows. The story faded from newspapers, buried by war and time. Yet the ruins of Broderick Plantation remained haunted. Visitors swore they could still see the imprints of hands in the old carriage house beams, as though strength beyond human measure had once pressed into the very wood. And sometimes, on still nights, they said you could hear the creak of iron bending and the heavy breath of a man who should not have existed. This mystery shows us that the greatest horrors in human history often arise not from supernatural forces but from the willingness of ordinary people to treat others as less than human when it serves their interests. But it also shows us that dignity and the desire for freedom are forces more powerful than any chain, any experiment, or any attempt to reduce people to property. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed? Or are there still secrets buried deep in our nation's archives? Leave your comment below and let us know what you think really happened to Elias and the others like him. If you enjoyed this tale of hidden history and human resilience, subscribe to our channel, hit the notification bell, and share this story with someone who loves dark mysteries. There are more forgotten chapters of our history waiting to be explored, and we'll be here to guide you through them. See you in the next video, where we'll uncover another story the powerful would rather keep buried.